that has been worked on across all members of the NCSR Plus. So this really is quite an exciting day. A lot to get into today's activities, but certainly we've got some real key moments, and I would really impress that you actually perhaps consider some of the content as we go through, because there will be an opportunity at the end for some question and answers, and hopefully we'll be able to provide that, or at least provide that conduit that we can actually gain that sort of shared knowledge and understanding. So yeah, we have come an awfully long way. There's been a lot of work and a huge amount of shared experiences and best practice shared across the organisation. But outside of NCSR, of course, the world has not stood still. We've had the launch of the Stronger LRFs programme, which is already well underway and making roads towards that whole society resilience. And it is certainly a pleasure today to be able to introduce Zonia Cavanagh from the Cabinet Office, who will be able to give some indications of that ongoing work for societal resilience. As I say, a huge amount to get through today, so I won't hold proceedings any longer at this point, but would certainly like to welcome Zonia to present to our group today, which we're now over 108. So a really positive response from the members to join in with today's meeting. So Zonia, if I can pass over to yourself.
That's great. Thanks very much, Chris. And thank you so much for Gordon and the consortium for inviting me to speak today. So great to see so many people on the call too, and still climbing. But I will take your hint and be brief with my words because there's a lot to get through. Unfortunately, I can't stay for the whole session. Always seems to clash with different things that I also need to be at. But if there's any other questions that come through over the course of the day, then please do let me or Ryan know, and we're more than happy to answer them separately. And continue this discussion, as I'm sure we will anyway, because I had the pleasure of speaking to the consortium back in July, and the head of resilience, Mary Jones, my boss, earlier in the year. So we'll definitely continue that ongoing dialogue. But it's great to see today these really useful tools being made more widely available. So I'll speak a bit about the resilience framework, our vision for whole of society and our approach to that, and some of the activities we've been doing by way of context. So the resilience framework was of course based on lessons from the many recent challenges we faced as a nation, both domestically and internationally, which have really fundamentally changed and challenged the way we see our own national resilience. And when we published it, we described that as a first step in what we're taking to address the challenges that we face. And it's our plan to fundamentally strengthen the systems and capabilities that underpin our resilience to this really changing and challenging risk profile. And of course, that isn't any one organisation's role. It's collectively together, given the all-encompassing nature of resilience. It's got to involve organisations across the public, private, civil society sectors, but also all of us as individuals and communities too. And our role really from the centre is to help facilitate and enable that, and to work collectively with all of you to do that too. So the clear ambition in the resilience framework sets out how we're going to change that system, and we identified 3 themes to underpin our work and deliver resilience for the UK, and that's a shared understanding of risk is fundamental. Wherever possible, prevention should be adopted over cure, and that resilience, of course, is a whole of society endeavour. And in the framework, the activity, the people, the systems which make up the UK's resilience is encapsulated in the description of whole of society endeavour. So our vision is that for a whole of society approach, it's one in which everyone recognises they have a part to play, takes responsibility and contributes to the UK's national resilience. And it's a society where people, communities are prepared and ready to take action to support themselves and each other during an emergency, so that our wider efforts can be focused on those most in need who can't help themselves, who can't take those actions themselves. Now, of course, we recognise the inherent challenges and complexity in doing that, and the successive emergencies have only demonstrated that in its entirety. But the importance of us all working coherently together, including structures at central government, to set those clear expectations on businesses, local tier, voluntary organisations, community group and public, what they can expect for us in government and across public services, but also what we expect for them to do as well. And that's very much an ongoing journey, which we welcome the work of the consortium in helping to shape and inform that too, and test that out and trial it in the ways of working which are being launched today. So the whole of society approach is really viewed as a process to support national resilience and not an end state. But our framework sets out how we'll go about strengthening some of those risk agnostic systems and capabilities that underpin our collective national resilience to all risks, both acute and chronic. And we've been doing a considerable amount of work to start putting that into place. And here's a few areas that we've been working on and are working on as the next stages, which are particular relevance to the whole of society approach. So we've been focusing on improving the understanding of risks, both across national and local government and the wider resilience community, and across private and voluntary sectors too. We recently published our National Risk Register, and that's the most transparent we've ever been in sharing more of the risks that are in the National Security Risk Assessment. Of course, there are some which for national security purposes we haven't, but wherever possible we've shared as much as possible, in line with our commitment to transparency, but to really in recognition of that wider audience to provide as much information as we can to be able to make those kind of own risk-based decisions and understand some of the challenges in more detail. So as businesses, as operators of essential services, as public, as academics, what the risks that we are looking at and how we understand them to be able to help prepare the UK more effectively. And we're continuing to build on that, to look at acute and chronic risks and considering strategic vulnerabilities as set out in the refresh of the integrated review, which was published a few months ago. We've also clarified departmental responsibilities on a UK-wide basis for risk identification, emergency preparedness, response and recovery. And we're currently assessing the challenges and gaps in our collective national resilience capabilities. We've also been refreshing our approach to training and exercising, revitalised the national exercise programme, and we're being more proactive in how we can share lessons, capture lessons from internationally and from other partners and all the good places that we should do holistically across the piece, and to share those publicly too. And version 3 of the Lessons Digest was published a few weeks ago. We're also currently designing a public survey to be conducted annually to better understand how prepared members of the public are for emergencies and to inform our future public risk communications and our work in this area collectively together. And the survey will be used to collect data on risk perceptions and information needs. What are some of those barriers and gaps, and how can we best collectively fill it? So we know the impact of emergencies is felt by everybody, and that some parts of society are more adversely affected than others and have disproportionate impacts and their ability to cope with emergencies. And so emergency planning response requires a considered approach for identifying and supporting those vulnerable people, and there's more that we could and should do. So at a national level, we're committed to developing a measurement of socioeconomic resilience, about how some of those impacts cut across communities and vulnerable groups, with all sorts of elements of vulnerability, so socio-economic as well as other disabilities or other markers of which could require extra support and assistance, and we are working with local partners to refresh guidance for how to best identify and support vulnerable people in preparation, response and recovery for emergencies. Chris has already mentioned the Stronger LRF programme, so building on those multi-agency building blocks and looking at how we can strengthen and enhance local resilience forums. The Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, of course, announced the 8 LRFs who will be working on that pilot and really testing out, you know, the ambitious programmes of chief resilience officers and how we can develop those strong democratic links, how we can join up across lots of the good work that's happening locally across environment, economic, education, growth policies, you know, as well as the work being done on resilience, so we can really try and adjust that prevention agenda from all angles and get everybody building resilience into what they do. And finally, of course, working with one of our other key partners and the voluntary and community sector, who are at the forefront of responses to emergencies and done great work supporting all of us in recent years. And so we've established a new strategic forum for engagement with the voluntary sector on the UK Resilience Forum. And having that additional space to have those discussions, as well as importantly, of course, those links very much happening at local and community levels too. So I'll finish just by highlighting the work of the consortium as, you know, a great example of living that whole of society approach and a leading example of working across boundaries to do so. The strategy and manual have been really carefully developed in consultation with a variety of stakeholders, and I know they can support local responders in considering their approaches and building resilience in their communities. So a huge thank you to Duncan, the consortium and everyone who's involved in that work, and look forward to continuing to work with you all and see how it's adapted and adopted and work with you on this going forward. Thank you very much, everyone.
Zonia, thank you so much for your presentation this morning, and it really is nice to hear that there are people all on the same journey. I think you were saying it's not an end state, it is a programme, it's a process, and perhaps there are significant milestones on that way. And we're all perhaps not starting at the same place, but it's important that we're all driving in the same direction to increase that whole of society resilience. And certainly, you know, the words from the Cabinet Office are certainly echoed very much by those members in the NCSR. So I feel good that we are working together in that respect, and certainly, as I say, the efforts of the last 2 years really have culminated in this strategy that can be presented, and as I say, there's been a huge amount of consultation and engagement to do that work. So thank you for your support and your words, and with that, I suppose we should say we'll come to the next point of today, and that is, of course, the strategy and the manual, which some will be more familiar with than others, but I'm sure that we've all been waiting to hear a little bit more of that detail and to be able to get our hands on and to actually operationalize some of those strategies and opportunities in the toolkit that can actually help us and others around the country to actually move forward with this whole society resilience. So at that point, thank you again, Zonia, and perhaps if I could welcome Duncan to speak to us, and also, of course, David Powell from the University of Manchester. So over to the two of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Zonia. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Duncan Shaw. I work at the University of Manchester, and I'm very pleased to be co-chair with Chris and Becky, who you'll meet a little bit later, co-chair of the National Consortium. David, would you like just to say hello?
Well, yeah, just a very quick hello to everybody. Great to see some familiar faces again. Great to be with you. So I work with Duncan and the team at the University of Manchester on this and other projects, but my background, for those of you who know me and who don't know me, was as the head of emergency management in Lincolnshire and secretariat for the Lincolnshire Resilience Forum, and a history in policing within the UK. So a good background in disaster management. But yeah, great to see you all today again. Thank you for coming today.
So just by way of introducing NCSR and the sort of journey we've been on very quickly, for those of you who don't know NCSR, because we realise that this is both an international audience but also an audience beyond the consortium, we have approximately 63 partners. Across our LRFs and resilience partnerships, we cover about 98% of the UK population, all focused on thinking about societal resilience and how do you support that, very much responding to what Zonia's talked around the UK Resilience Framework and the agenda of strengthening a whole of society approach to resilience. One of our first activities as a consortium was to put focus on a strategy. It's not a strategy for the consortium, but a strategy for societal resilience to support local partners where they want to make a step change around societal resilience in their endeavour. So we began, as Chris said, 24 months of development. We worked across the consortium and developed ideas and processes, and then tested those in mostly two LRFs, South Yorkshire and Greater Manchester, who were brave enough to come with us on this early journey and provide us with tremendous feedback on the strategy that we're developing, the manual to deliver that, and incredibly grateful to them for their effort. And I know that some members of their LRFs are on the call. As Zonia said, that this is not static, so we're not presenting to you a final piece of work. Because we will be continuing working with other LRFs in the coming year and hopefully beyond. 3 LRFs at least in the next year, and we will take learning from that to continue to develop this. But what we wanted to share with you today is where we're up to around strategy manual and that first piece of work that has been generously supported by 28 of the LRFs in commissioning this work. Andrew, I think you've got control of the slides. Could we move to the next slide, please? So David and I are going to take you through where are we up to? Where are we up to with regards to what Andrew, David, and some of you may know Roisin, who is not on the call today, but where are we up to with regards to societal resilience, David?
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, so let's really just remind ourselves of the journey that we've taken from the last 10, 15 years. I guess some of us on the call would have been through it personally. Some of you may be quite new to it, but reflecting back, certainly when I started within the emergency management world, the response to disruptions was very much, I guess, defined by a feeling that we were here to save people. You know, it was the moral obligation of responding organisations to organise themselves, you know, create emergency plans in order to be able to respond to big events and save their local communities. But I guess the problem became how realistic that was. Some of the events are just so big that they were always going to overwhelm local responses and would require something slightly larger, more coordinated, more formal. You know, we often would see very successful but independent, sometimes unsupported and uncoordinated community responses and huge voluntary responses, because people will always want to help in a crisis, but it was often done at arm's length to the official response. There were often some issues of reputation and trust, and I guess some of that played out in more recent years as well. And from an official responder's point of view, certainly from an emergency services perspective, a very understandable, you know, kind of risk-averse approach to wanting to engage some of that community and voluntary response, because you don't understand who some of these people are, their skills, their capabilities. But as we started to really get into the phase of looking at some of the bigger events that would affect the UK, and in my personal experience, coastal flooding was the best example, I think we started to very much shift our mindset towards, look, we are prepared as an official partnership, as an official set of responders, but are you as the local community, do you understand the risk? To go back to Zonia's point about the current aspirations for the framework, do you understand what might happen to you in your locality? You know, how aware can we make local communities of those risks, and how would they react? Do we understand exactly what their perception of risk would be and their actions, if indeed ever called to action? And the kind of continuity support arrangements locally for local essential services and businesses. And then equally importantly, do we understand some of those hidden communities, some of those harder to reach groups that have come to the fore in recent years during COVID, certainly. And again, bringing it onto COVID very nicely, you know, that completely overwhelming, generous response from society in general, whether it be good neighbours, community support, community responses, or indeed organised or spontaneous volunteers, an absolute outpouring of brilliant response, unthinkable levels of responding. But also we began to understand how interconnected some of the systems were for trying to bring all this together. In the first few months of COVID, Duncan and I were fascinated to see how often local authorities in particular and LRS were beginning to understand that it was far better not to try to interfere too much in what society was doing, but actually to stand back a little bit and ask a very, very different question around how can we actually support what you're trying to do out there for each other in streets, communities, towns, etc. But in reality, if you talk about community resilience, it just seems to remain very hard to deliver. Andrew, please, if you'd. Thank you. So let's have a look. Great idea. I think from its inception, everybody signed up to the idea, the concept of community resilience. Particularly they like the idea of cherished communities supporting each other, communities being able to direct their own futures. But too often in our experience, it got boiled down to leaflets, websites, reaching out to the very easy to reach communities, parishes who wanted to engage with LRFs, and of course volunteering as a continuous core. But it also tended to fizzle out into singular, rather short-term approaches. It remains very challenging to deliver, and of course the strategy and the manual is very much focused in on not the what to do, but how to do it. Which we'll go on to explain in a minute, but very much pinning it down as to, well, what is it? What does it mean? How do you build it? How indeed can you mobilise it? Is it a capability that can be seen as a very useful resource when responding or recovering from disasters? And of course, then beautifully timed, the resilience framework comes along, setting a really good new, quite exciting, innovative mandate for LRS going forward. And this idea, the concept of a national joined up endeavour to try to improve the resilience of the UK. But it's clear when you read the document and you look at the journey we've taken through community resilience into societal resilience, it very much is about a change in mindset, a change of approach, and the change that in the way that we try to deliver societal resilience into the future. It's very much the focus of what the strategy and the manual and the toolkit is designed to do. Duncan, maybe you say a little bit more about the difference between community resilience and societal resilience.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so and I'm going to ask Andrew if he could put a link to the strategy manual into the chat, please, for those of you who haven't seen it. In terms of moving from societal or community resilience to societal resilience, we think that there is huge benefits in community resilience, of course, but the societal resilience is a little bit wider. It brings in other partners. It puts different emphasis not only on neighbourhoods and communities, but on the infrastructure, the businesses and the surrounding hinterland that can really contribute into the resilience of a place. We think that it requires strategic and political direction, and that was very clear from the UK Resilience Framework. It's saying that we need to very much take a strategic approach to this, because some of the short-term approaches that David's mentioned might not have had the impact that we thought they were going to have when we started out on them. Yes, of course, it's about spontaneous volunteers. It's about affected communities. They're always going to want to come and help. They're always going to want to have their influence, as David said. And are you ready for that? Are you ready to be able to coordinate the effort, the goodwill that's going to come to the fore to meet that need? We think it's about adopting good practices, but as I said, they haven't always had the success that they expected. Well, why not? Well, we think it's because the foundations are different. We think that because when we look across at one area, we see good practice happening, trying to port it into a different place is not always easy because the foundations are different. And what the strategy and manual try to do is both understand what are the good foundations, but also how to develop those foundations and how to personalise those foundations to a particular LRF, a particular resilience partnership. Very much it's about looking at society and thinking about how can we use that as a valuable resource? How can we harness that goodwill? Because it is essential to resilience. So across all partners, not only situated in local government, but across all partners, not only situated in fire or in any particular project, but how do we harness that across all partners and almost come to societal resilience with an LRF-wide mindset of looking at society and thinking about them as a valuable resource, but also knowing that we need to support their resilience in order to get the best out of them. As David said, it's not about looking at back at past practices and saying, well, we can't do that because it didn't have the effect last time we did it. Well, maybe because the foundations were wrong. But similarly, it's not about doing the same thing as you did last time and expecting a different result when the conditions haven't changed. So very much it's about looking at ownership and thinking about who actually owns these challenges and then working with those partners. And when we get on to the strategy, the 8 steps that we've identified, we'll talk a lot about that. And at the fundamental proposition that we have through the strategy is about operationalising society resilience as a local resilience capability. So this is about not talking about societal resilience as a vague concept, but it's saying, how do we operationalise it? And how do we operationalise it as a capability that we can almost press a button on in order to activate, recognising that of course there will be some resilience within society that will always be there. But how can we, as an LRF, as a resilience partnership, how can we activate that capability and what are the benefits of doing that? David. David's on mute.
Yeah, apologies. So I love that idea of seeing society as a valuable resource, and certainly Duncan and I have done a lot of time, spent a lot of time reflecting on some of the recent events, the obvious ones like severe weather here in the UK. I don't think these are going to be unique to the UK, by the way, but they're illustrative for those on the call. The Manchester Arena attacks, Grenfell Tower, which I still believe is going to teach us an awful lot about reaching out to hidden communities and understanding local fragilities, and also, of course, COVID, the largest event we've all experienced recently. But to go back to that point about them being a valuable resource, it became clear to us that society pinpointed answers because they most often were best placed to understand local risk and vulnerabilities far better than a lot of us are now as formal responders or indeed the providers of local services. They certainly created new capabilities and had the ability to manage immediate consequences and longer term needs over a prolonged period. In COVID in particular, it was quite phenomenal how effective people were at sticking around to the very end. And of course, we understood that most of society can be resilient. We should be proud that most of the UK community can be very resilient to those acute shocks and critical stresses that we'll suffer. There is an unlimited capacity of communities out there if you can harness it. Of course, doing that requires a slightly different mindset. A mindset is something that will keep coming back to you again throughout the presentation, I think, and throughout the whole journey of NCSR. To shift to seeing society as that valuable resource, we really do need to embed resilience within partnerships, certainly local partnerships, and get slightly more away from the response element of how we arrange our business. We certainly need to act now. We think now is the best time that there's probably ever been to translate the framework's ambitions and aspirations into something concrete and deliverable, certainly before fatigue, politics, and other challenges will get in the way. And we also need to exploit that much better understanding we now do have of inequalities and fragilities, whether that's in systems or indeed within local vulnerabilities or local communities, and in particular some of the sensitivities of local community needs within risk areas, all of which of course needs to have a kind of an assurance underpinning it that recognises that disasters are owned by society. Of course they are. Global challenges, huge shocks can come along that are beyond our control. The reality is they're always going to be felt by local people, no matter what the cause is, and they'll always want to be owned by local communities. We recognise society is not all in the same place, and the manual and the strategy you'll see is very much about trying to help you to put some sense around how to prioritise and start to really hone in on the most important parts of society that do need a little bit of help, or indeed don't have the capacity to do things for themselves. And we're very much wanting to try to encourage a cohesive, joined up system that looks at managing consequences, with some of the assurance that Zonia was referring to earlier on around the LRF strengthening programme in particular. But Duncan, I wonder if you just take us on to the next step.
Yeah, so some of the concepts that are in the strategy is around, as you can guess, strategic capability. This is at the heart of it. So that societal resilience, I mentioned about the vagueness, it requires a very clear strategy. It requires that vagueness to be pinned down. It not to be a series of transactional activities that are unrelated, unconnected, and perhaps pull in different directions. It's about having strategic oversight, and then all of that activity can feed into achieving that strategic direction that has been set and owned by the Resilience Partnership. That partnership involving a broader range of partners, not only emergency planners, obviously they've got a key role, but there are wider partners that are absolutely key, that are already working on resilience of their areas, and really important to bring them in. It's about a local capability, so not short term. This is an ongoing endeavour, one that the LRF, the Resilience Partnership, can really get behind and realise that, as David said, it's not about a website. It's about a series of, or a programme of activity, all sitting under a strategy that moves the dial on the resilience of a place. It is about priority groups, we think. We think that there is capability that can help address some of the most challenged people, the most at risk, the most vulnerable. The issue with whole of society resilience is it doesn't put that specific focus on vulnerable people. And so one of the challenges that we've grappled with is it's not about everyone everywhere all at once right now. There are priority groups out there who require support. And so we need to start with thinking about those groups that are at risk, who are vulnerable, who don't have preparedness, they don't have awareness, they don't have agency. It can't be everything right now, or else as a community we will get lost and challenged again by some of the troubles that we've had in the past, perhaps of lacking focus. We think that it is about freeing responders to focus on those who are most at risk. It's not about expecting a volunteer who has never had any engagement in response in engaging with the most at risk, the most vulnerable populations. So the capability can address some of the less risk activities, allowing responders who can deal with risk, who are professionally trained, to support those who are at risk and who are vulnerable. In creating this capability, we think it's necessary to start simple, to start with just one. And one what? Well, one group, it could be one community group, it could be one place, draw a boundary around it, it could be one partner, and begin to prove concept, to create a bit of momentum, to create some confidence around this, and then use that experience to roll it out to another place, to another group, to another partner. So what we're saying is that it doesn't need to be huge. It's not a single creation. It's not, I am going to create a societal resilience programme and I'm going to do it over the next 12 months. It's something that grows and develops from humble beginnings, and it can grow and develop into something that is quite ambitious, probably more ambitious than the initial ambition, which we think could remain quite modest. So it is, David, you're going to talk about intelligent resilience.
Yeah, so we're trying to deliver to you a system that operationalises societal resilience. So how do we turn this into a useful resource? How can we support society, deliver a range of functions that concentrates in on some of those priorities? And the term we've come up with is we think this is very much about a slightly more intelligent approach to resilience, a much more targeted insight into some of the needs and the vulnerabilities, better understanding of some of the sensitivities in affected communities, especially those that are at risk, either because they're a community of type or a community of place, and then understand the prioritisation, the needs to match the support on offer from communities, volunteers, and also those that most in need, and then trying to form a system that helps you to deliver that in a coherent, a joined up way, one that would make sense within the official response in particular. ConOps, sorry for the short term, but concept of operations, clearly to make that work, to see society as a useful resource, we need to make sure that it's embedded within a concept of operations at the official response and recovery, especially if you really want to make it coherent and consistent. So it does require a different approach to policy, procedure, practice, the ability to formally convert those offers into something useful. Duncan, maybe you just explain that last little bit about how we match the needs with the support on offer.
Yeah, so in terms of operationalising, we think it's about understanding what need is. Needs of those priority groups that I mentioned earlier, or groups who are at risk, vulnerable, don't have agency, are unaware, are unprepared. Think about what are their needs and go out and find out about those needs, whether they're individuals, whether they're places, whether they're organisations that provide essential services, whether they're networks that you want to provide support to, all of those things that were mentioned in the resilience framework as being part of society. And then thinking about, well, if that's the need, then what is the corresponding support? So where does support come from individuals, groups, organisations, networks? Where does support come from the services that can provide support to those vulnerable people? And we think that by starting there, we can really prioritise delivering a capability to address a need. That's not to say that we ignore people who don't have immediate needs, not at all, because there's almost a separate range of activities for them, a separate range of support that we can provide to them. But it's about activating their resilience. It's about helping them to understand what it is that they might want to think about doing and how they might want to think about doing it. So not everybody will have immediate needs or higher needs, hence the focus on priority areas, David.
Thanks,
Andrew,
Duncan. Through the chat, just ask for a clarification of IGION, which I think you've just provided around.
Yeah, sorry, so individuals, groups, organisations and networks, just there wasn't enough space in the box.
No, that's great. Thanks, Duncan. Andrew, if you want moving on. So one of the critical things here is why do we think this is different? One of the key differences we truly believe this is a strategy. This cannot be a bit of local activity decided, I guess, operationally during a crisis. We believe this means it requires something much more fundamental in the relationship between the responding organisations and partnerships and local society in order to make societal resilience really thrive as a capability. And it comes down to some very fundamental questions for strategic leaders to decide about the nature of that relationship individually within each circumstances. Do you want to decline it because it's just not a safe environment, for example, quite rightly, or do you want to embrace it because you can see an absolute need and also a good connection to the objectives you're trying to achieve? Do you want to observe it at arm's length, or would you like to integrate it so actually it can formally provide capacity and resilience to the capabilities that you're delivering as a partnership? Do you want to allow it or enable it? Do you want to be more active, proactive in the way that you might put training and supervision of some of the activities in place? Or do you want to merely monitor what societies do, because frankly it can be left best to do it by itself, but with a little bit of coordination and communication between the official response so everybody understands where this might contribute or fit. In order to do these things, of course, we believe that that needs some kind of design, some kind of system to make sure this will work consistently in every disruption that a local partnership may end up managing. And of course, it also needs to have that flexibility and scalability. We've gone from, single events in the UK where you'll have 100 spontaneous volunteers turning up to events where we've now seen over 350,000 volunteers turn up, and then exponentially even more of that during COVID around the globe. So it really is fundamentally about a strategic relationship that sees society as a useful resource and wants to translate it into a deliverable operational capability. And to repeat, without wanting to keep on hammering in the point, the strategy and the manual is very much the how to do it that helps you achieve that outcome. Thanks, Duncan.
just to pick up on a point that David mentioned, was that that's not to say that the LRF or the Resilience Partnership will want to try and control or manage all activity that's happening within a place. Not at all. Community groups will get on and do activity. Individuals will volunteer and help neighbours, and that can all be encouraged and not sought to be managed, not sought to come under the capability at all. What we're talking about is where that capability exists, is that there's certain almost principles as to when the capability can be used and can be deployed. We think that within the strategy, within the manual, there are a number of modules that can begin to almost develop different activities that sit underneath that strategy, and 5 of them are on the board. I'm just going to pick up on the first one, community hubs. So in a recent meeting of the funders of NCSR and of the wider consortium, we decided that next year will be a year where we start putting some effort on community hubs and thinking about how do we develop a community hub principle, a community hub design that can support support communities, can support individuals, organisations, networks, that can support these different needs that they might have. So, of course, there are a whole range of modules that could potentially be developed, but what we think is that the first module that we will develop over the coming year is that one around community hubs, because that seems to be the one where partners are really quite excited about the opportunities that lie therein. In the interest of time, David, I think we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. So in the interest of time, Andrew, next slide, please. So the steps to develop the strategy to develop the local resilience capability are now on the slide. So step 1 is about alignment, and it's really about aligning the people and the politics. And David's going to talk more about this in a moment, so I'll move quite quickly on. But we see that ambition, that aligning people around that ambition is absolutely key. The design is where we start to take the people who have that shared ambition and start to think about establishing a team to design and assess current performance in step 2. So here the team is thinking about, well, what is it that we want to do and what are we going to do to meet this ambition? Step 3 is designing a business case and setting very clear strategic objectives that the Resilience Partnership can get behind and can support. And then beginning in step 4 to co-design activities that, like community hubs, that can really help to deliver that local resilience capability. So steps 1, 2, 3 and 4 are all that design phase, and we've had the pleasure of moving through that with South Yorkshire and seeing how they have developed their strategy that's recently been signed off by the LRF Strategic Board. Steps 4, 5, 6, and steps 5 through to 8 are all about implementation and evaluation. So here it's in step 5, it's about developing really instrumental collaborations, is identifying those key people who you know are going to pull their weight, they're going to work together, and they're going to get it done in terms of delivering those activities from step 4. Those activities will develop the capability, which will then be managed on an ongoing basis within step 6. And the evaluation will be both spread across step 7 and step 8, in terms of how to understand that value and what the value proposition is, but measuring it and assessing it, and then constantly feeding back that information back into the design and the implementation of the strategy. So the strategy, in terms of 8 steps, we think, David, that one of the most challenging of steps has been step 1. Next slide, please, Andrew.
Yeah, and I'll let me just concentrate on the first column. You put all 3 columns up, Andrew, but I'll talk to the first column in a little bit more detail. Politics, aligning the politics. What we mean is, again, this could never be an emergency planning officer activity alone without any support, direction, or indeed strategic buy-in. So we think it's really important that resilience partnerships, be it here in the UK or indeed globally, look at some of the broader agendas and try to bring other people who are already in this space. So, you know, a few obvious examples: climate change, adaptability, organised crime, public safety, you know, health and well-being, the environment, economic development locally, all will have societal resilience elements or contributions to make. And I think the only way to bring those together into the same space is clearly from a kind of strategic and a political context, especially locally, when you talk about place management, trying to support communities of type, communities of place who are most vulnerable or indeed at risk from local consequences of risk, threat, you know, disasters, disruption. That accountability piece, I won't talk in any more detail. Zonia's already introduced it to you. Other than saying that relationship between local democratic leaders and the Resilience Partnership is clearly key. I don't see how you can't have place leaders involved in deciding or determining some of the approaches to engaging with communities and society as part of a solution. And then, of course, the really important bit, ensuring it can be achieved. You know, that buy-in to ensure there's resources, time, effort, and indeed direction, policy support where required to make sure that you can deliver societal resilience, especially if, like us, you see it very much as being a useful local capability. I won't cover the other two columns because I do think we've referred to them earlier in the presentation, but that I think is the most critical step in our experience. Without this, it's incredibly hard to achieve community resilience. It's almost impossible to move the dial into societal resilience. So we really wanted to land very much on this slide as being one of the key messages for what both the strategy and the manual tries to help you design. But yeah, thank you, Duncan. I think I'll leave it to that for that particular slide.
Great.
Which takes me on to the next one, please, Andrew. And again, thinking back to the really important words of Zonia at the beginning and the buy-in to the consortium throughout the last 18 months, we really also think the whole ecosystem needs just a little bit of tweaking around making sure that that national coherence is always clear and agreed and accepted by everybody. So that policy framework, the renewed guidance, the development of capabilities, resources, you know, articulating exactly what this national endeavour may indeed look like if you describe success remains incredibly important. Systems cohesion is simply recognising that disasters is not solely a Resilience Partnership responsibility. You know, system interconnectedness, interdependencies was so much to the fore during COVID that we really hadn't ought to step back from that understanding now. We need to keep on making sure that systems approaches are maintained. And then that local consistency, which is I think where the consortium is trying to fit very nicely to make a contribution. The nature of resilience partnerships, the way that the business model works, you know, whether you can truly make sure that something like this can be achieved strategically, delivered locally, the translation of practice and standards, local alignment, you know, dealing with all the maturity issues, the differences between some of the LRS, but understanding there's probably actually more similarities than there are differences out there. And then again, that most important bit about driving local leadership and configuration. I think you're just going to talk in the last slide, Duncan, about some of the underpinning foundations to societal resilience.
Yeah, so actually, David, I'm going to move on, if you don't mind, to what does the future look like for us?
Sure. Yeah.
So, because we've talked a lot about foundations, we've talked a lot about strategy, and what are we going to do in the coming months? Well, we're going to develop modules. We're going to develop a module around community hubs, as I said, and continuously try and develop the materials that we've got. We've got the strategy manual, and we've developed and prepared a toolkit that's gone out. And what these documents, as I've said, they're not static. We will continually improve them based on the experiences that we will develop with other LRFs as we continually implement this strategy. We're going to keep sharing good new learning. We're going to identify practice that we think is really useful to the UK and share that. As I said, it's available on YouTube, and you can search MCSR on YouTube and get a whole range of different webinars that we've run. We were going to run a conference on the 5th and 6th of March in Manchester. I think Andrew will talk a little bit more about that at the very end of this. There's opportunities to get involved in the conference if you wish. And really, we're going to hopefully continue to contribute to the conversation. You know, we're very much looking to local to see, well, how can we make a difference to this at the local, listening to what national direction is coming. And David, we're going to have a training offer.
Yeah, most of you know that we've developed a training package for the consortium members specifically. We think it has a wider offer for those of you who may find it useful, very much about trying to define, demystify, simplify societal resilience, but then actually working through those 8 steps within the strategy and manual in a lot more detail about exactly how to do it, how to establish a structure, how to approach it, how to develop those instrumental relationships, collaborations that Duncan mentioned earlier on. I don't want to go into detail. I think we've outrun the clock a little bit here. We can deliver it both virtually and in person. It's better to be done as a facilitated session with the teams of people strategically right the way through to operational partners who would deliver societal resilience. But please give us a shout if you would find that very useful. But no, thank you, Duncan.
Thank you. And that is it. Thank you very much for listening. Chris, may I hand back to you?
Yes, and thank you both, Duncan and David, for that really detailed cover of the strategy and that manual. There's going to be some very good bedtime reading I can see coming out following today. A lot of what we've talked about so far has been that resilience that impacts the UK, and since the start of NCSR, of course, we've had quite a number of case studies, many of which have been across the UK and partners, but equally we have to look at that international element because there is learning taking place all over the world, and if we fail to engage and embrace and understand the learning that is being achieved on that international area, then we are also failing to consider some of those areas within our own control and remit. So now we're going to go across to Representative Karl Astbury from the Resilient Cities Network. Good morning, Karl. I really do welcome your contribution to today's webinar. So I shall mute my mic and hand over to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that great intro. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karl Astbury, and I'm really honoured to represent the Resilient Cities Network today. I'm just going to briefly talk about some of our international work to build community resilience to climate hazards, and posit some thoughts that will hopefully be useful in your work going forward. I know that the work that the consortium has been undertaking and is undertaking has been hugely valuable to our own practice. And this, of course, builds on the collaboration between the Resilient Cities Network and the University of Manchester during the darkest days of COVID, and the great work that Duncan and David led, sharing global lessons and knowledge on what cities and places were doing to respond and recover. Next slide. So our Resilience for Communities programme is a collaboration with the Z Zurich Foundation. We've been deeply involved with the communities of Boston and Houston, and we're now extending our reach to Greater Manchester and Malacca in Malaysia. And our approach is not top-down, it's rooted in listening to people, understanding their resilience needs, and then taking actionable steps. And this is resilience building from the ground up, a model that respects local wisdom, whilst also incorporating global and national expertise. Next slide, please. But here are we. We're the Resilient Cities Network, and we see ourselves as more than just an organisation. We see ourselves as a global movement, and we are partners with many cities across the world, working across 47 countries, 6 continents, and in 21 languages. And in the UK, this includes the cities of Greater Manchester, London, Glasgow, Bristol, and Belfast. And we want to, in essence, improve the well-being of millions of urban dwellers. And we're not just a network; we're a global family committed to a safer, more equitable, and sustainable future. Next slide, please. So, how do we conceptualize resilience? And everyone on this call will know that there's lots and lots of definitions that abound when we talk about resilience. And We believe it's the capacity of our cities, its people, its institutions, its very fabric to not just survive, but to adapt and thrive come what may. And in a world where climate change is not a distant threat, but a present reality, urban resilience, I believe, and we believe, is our collective responsibility. So acute shocks, they're the sudden intensive events that threaten a community, such as earthquakes, hurricanes, terrorist attacks. And the impact of acute shocks is exacerbated by chronic stresses that weaken the fabric of a community over time. And this could be recurrent flooding, high unemployment, limited social safety nets, and inequitable public transport systems. And it's rare that a city or place experiences just one type of challenge at a time. Instead, cities and places are confronted by combinations of acute shocks and chronic stresses. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, resilience is not just about bouncing back, it's about bouncing forward. I think we see every shock, every stress as an opportunity to evolve, to innovate, and to emerge stronger than before. And this is not just an optimistic viewpoint, it's a strategic approach backed by science and social theory. Next slide, please. And our city resilience framework is a compass guiding cities through 12 key drivers that collectively enhance resilience. And urban resilience demands that cities and places look holistically at their capacities and their risks, including through meaningful engagement with the most vulnerable members of the community. Now, one of the things I want to say is this is not easy work. Urban governance is often siloed with separate teams, leading maybe disaster recovery plans or management plans, another team exploring sustainability issues, another team looking at livelihoods and well-being, another team looking at land use planning, another team or another organisation in many cases looking at infrastructure. And this approach, this siloed approach, cannot meet the demands of today's interconnected world. So cities and places need to see themselves as systems, not silos. And cities and places are made up of people often experiencing rapid change. Next slide, please. I'll just put this photo up here. This quote challenges us almost to rethink resilience. It's not just an attribute that someone has, but a responsibility that we should take on board. It's a call to action. We shouldn't just admire resilience in people or communities, but we should facilitate it. And as well as this, what does it mean when we label a community or an individual as vulnerable? Is that how they would like to be defined? What about issues of equity and justice? How does this all play into our work? And these are issues that we are thinking about, grappling with and working through. And it's important that we think about those who contributed the least to climate change. Those are the people who are now bearing the brunt, both of the impact and also the work to create solutions. Community resilience and any vulnerabilities are arguably issues of equity and justice. Are communities or individuals inherently vulnerable, or do our communities face barriers to resilience? And how do we help remove those barriers? Next slide, please. So our Resilience for Communities programme is not an isolated initiative. It's a cog in a much larger machine aimed at systemic change. And we're part of a global network that synergizes different programmes, expertise and resources to hopefully create a multiplier effect. When we talk about resilience, we're talking about a whole range of global efforts and each effort strengthening each other. Next slide, please. So we're part of an ecosystem. The Zurich Foundation focuses on climate adaptation, mental well-being and social equity as their core missions. And we're also supported by the Zurich Insurance Group and collaborate with 5 other international implementing partners, including ourselves. And this is under the banner of the Urban Climate Resilience Programme. And this partnership allows us to tackle resilience from various angles, from mental health to social justice, all underpinned by a commitment to climate adaptation. Next slide, please. And we're not working in silos. We're part of a collective involving 11 cities and 5 implementing organisations. And it's all about learning, sharing and networking. And the power of this collaboration lies in its diversity. Different cities, different challenges, but a unified goal. You can see it as a living lab where we test theories, validate models, and share best practices. And the reason I mention this is I believe the National Consortium for Societal Resilience is doing something very similar. Different actors from across the UK sharing approaches, testing new ideas and producing knowledge, all to improve the resilience and well-being of our respective communities. Next slide, please. And we don't want to just be passive listeners. We aim to be active facilitators, ensuring that these voices, those voices within our communities, translate into policies, actions, and tangible changes. And why? Now, I'm going to talk a bit about the efforts to adapt to climate change in Europe. The most vulnerable groups in society are still the most affected. Projected climate change, an aging society, and persisting inequalities mean that differences in vulnerability and exposure to climate change are likely to continue. In addition, adaptation responses may worsen existing inequalities or even create new ones. And an analogy which I think is useful, when we think about the technological and communication revolution that's happened over the last 20 years, have the benefits been equally distributed 20 years later? Now, or has it worsened inequalities? Or has it created new ones, such as the digital divide? And when we work to build resilience, we must make sure that this work doesn't unintentionally create or further inequalities. The work to transform our societies in the face of climate change is arguably as big a transformation as the technological one we've seen and are in, or at least it should be. And so we've got to be really careful that we don't maladapt. So next slide, please. So why community resilience? Communities are the heartbeat of resilience. They're often the first responders, as everyone on this call knows, and their capacity to collaborate can significantly impact a hazard's outcome. To address systemic inequities, we must start at the community level. Now, this is not just a social imperative, it's a resilience imperative. The more inclusive our resilience building efforts are, the more robust they will be. Next slide, please. So this maybe is something which is quite useful. The 5 capitals, many of you will have come across this before. And I like to kind of test my thinking against these 5 capitals and to think of community resilience maybe a bit like a puzzle composed of 5 different types of capital: human, social, financial, natural, and physical. Now, each one of these capitals is indispensable. And human capital is about education and skills. Social capital is about networks and relationships. Financial capital is about economic resources. Natural capital is about the environment, and physical capital is about infrastructure and the built environment and housing. And together they form the bedrock of any resilient community. And this, importantly, takes us beyond just thinking about typical disaster risk management interventions, and think more carefully about the drivers of vulnerability and their importance when we're trying to build community resilience. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go into detail on this, but over the next 3 years in our work in Greater Manchester and Malacca, we're going to undergo 4 critical phases, and that's initiating the programme, conducting research, talking, listening to community members, developing a co-production approach in terms of actions, and then implementing solutions. And each phase is a stepping stone towards our ultimate goal. But I think it's been mentioned earlier, resilience is not a destination, it's a journey. And on this journey, we'll be running parallel streams of communications, knowledge sharing, and advocacy to ensure that our efforts are not just localised, but are globalised. And then my last slide, please. So I was trying to think of 3 things to, for people to potentially take away. And those 3 things are be intentional, be inclusive, and be integrative. And these are not just words, they're imperatives, I think, for effective resilience building. So being intentional means having a clear vision and metrics to measure success. Thinking about resilience of what, to what, for who. How will you monitor and evaluate you achieving what you set out to do? Have you thought about the potential for replicability and scalability? And being inclusive means involving all stakeholders, especially marginalised communities. And lastly, being integrative means creating a synergy between different sectors, different disciplines, policies, strategies, and communities. So last slide, please. I did say that one was the last one. There is one more, just the closing one. So just want to say thank you for your time and attention. This work isn't easy, but it's massively important and it's essential. And we've all got to kind of lean into this challenge, be brave, and we've got to advocate for local change if necessary. And I just want to wish everyone all the best in all the continued exciting work to build societal resilience. And I look forward to learning from everyone as we globally continue our journey to create a just and more equitable future for our most vulnerable communities across the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Karl. And you know, it really does remind me, it doesn't matter whereabouts we are in the world, we all have those challenges, and society can work together to make a more society, or to create more society resilience. So it is brilliant. And there was a couple of words you used a couple of times in that: holistic. This is a word we have often used here. We really do need to look at the whole picture, and that holistic approach is certainly going to be important to all of our organisations across the country. And also that reference to silo working, it is unhelpful. You know, we need to have those barriers broken down so that we can work collectively for the greater good. So thank you very much indeed for your contribution today. We will be doing some Q&As at the end of today's meeting, and I do hope that you might stay on in case there's questions from the panel. I can see some activity in that chat box behind. However, if I could move on now to Andrew McClelland to give a little update on NCSR Plus going forward. So over to you, Andrew.
Hi, Chris. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I won't detain you for too long because I can see, as Chris referenced, then lots of questions beginning to come in. And so I'm really just going to underline a number of the things that have already been mentioned, particularly by Duncan and David. Obviously culminating in particular with a bit of a plug in relation to the second National Conference on Societal Resilience, which we're already in the foothills of preparing the programme for, and that conference will take place on the 5th and 6th of March 2024 in Manchester. We obviously already had the first national conference in Manchester in March earlier this year, and it was a great success. So obviously we're keen then to begin the process of bringing together the programme for the next. So this is really a date for your diary. Clearly this webinar is important, particularly in relation to kind of launching the strategy and the manual, but we do intend to organise another webinar series that will happen in autumn and winter, and I think it's basically to keep your eyes and ears open for information as we bring forward the dates of that webinar programme. Clearly, as Duncan mentioned at the beginning, we have already had, I think, 13 webinars so far since the establishment of the NCSR, all of which are recorded and are available for people to watch back to who perhaps weren't able to attend, and that will also be the intent of the upcoming webinar series. As Duncan also mentioned at the very beginning of his joint presentation, clearly the strategy and the manual has very much been developed with the wider partners within the NCSR, but obviously then with particular reference to a number of the kind of implementation case studies with specific resilience partnerships. That work will continue, and we'll obviously be drawing in a number of new resilience partnerships to continue that implementation activity, which will then clearly feed into the various kind of learning processes that we have in place in relation to the strategy and manual. So it's really just to flag up, I guess, these important activities anticipated over the next 6 months or so. And with that, Chris, I'll wrap up, and obviously people will have an opportunity to pose their questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So now, last item for today, I'll get this in as quickly as possible because I know there are a number of questions. I'd like to welcome Becky Heginbotham-Blount, and if perhaps Duncan, David and Karl would be available to support any of the questions and answers that are going to be posed. So over to you. Thank you very much, Becky.
Hi everyone, I'm Becky Heginbotham-Blount from the Suffolk Resilience Forum and one of the co-chairs of the consortium. I've picked up some questions in the chat and then I'd like to invite people to put their hands up as well if you've got any more follow-up questions for our speakers. The first one I picked up was from Alex, a question for Karl about asking about your urban designs. So she's put the development, so with urban designs and the development management too, with the intention of designing resilient physical environments to influence resilience behaviours. Is that the point of your message there, just to confirm that?
Thank you. I can't see the chat, unfortunately, to see the questions because
No.
I need resilience. Well, my IT equipment needs to be more resilient, so I've had to join on my phone, so I can't see the question. But I think what, if I understand it correctly, what I was trying to say is you need to almost think about which voices are missing when you are thinking about community resilience. So I've worked in emergency planning, and I work for the Greater Manchester LRF. And so I've got lots of experience overall of kind of working at that multi-agency partnership level. And actually, we're very good at coming together, developing plans, responding and recovering, and putting all our efforts into kind of protecting our communities and then helping them recover. But how often do we intentionally talk to our communities, talk to individuals, talk to community leaders, talk to faith representatives? And I think the voluntary community sector are essential in this. Local authorities and the work on place-based public services is essential, and that's where I think potentially when you're thinking about maybe building community resilience to a particular hazard, and you're thinking about which community, Duncan mentioned it, mentioned earlier, start small. Start small and then think about which voices are not usually involved, and see how it develops. Be ready to be challenged, be ready for perspectives to be challenged, because that's all. If we take a learning mindset, none of us has got the answers. We need to have this learning mindset, be ready to be challenged, and to kind of almost open our doors up to the voices of the communities that we're trying to serve. In my opinion.
Thanks, Karl. Alex, I've noticed that you popped on camera. Did you have anything else for Karl as you're there?
Yeah, no, my question was probably more in whether he'd had any experience or examples of dealing with planning departments or local authorities in terms of specific urban design, the physical environment, as well as to in order to influence the behaviour, societal behaviour, really, because I've been speaking to one of our local authorities who, through the RTPI, who's a senior town planner, and we're looking, because that particular authority is looking at their local plan, we're looking at the possibility of trying to put into policy, influence policy, in order to start talking about community resilience. So obviously, just because I thought that's what you'd said, I wondered whether you got any experience that you could share in that sort of arena.
I think if you can get some kind of resilience policy within any spatial framework that you're developing, that's a win, first of all. The issue is lots of things get kind of value engineered out of designs. Everything's all bells and whistles when new developments are being planned. When it actually gets to delivery, lots of those brilliant things about sustainability or about resilience get kind of value engineered out. It's too expensive. So it's how do we kind of create that kind of advocate for those interventions? Because it's the built environment is hugely important to urban resilience. It's hugely important to community resilience as well. So how can we make our built environment serve the communities that it's meant to serve? I don't know whether that's helpful at all, but.
Brilliant. Lovely, thank you. Thanks, Karl. The next question from Valeria. I'm not sure who this is aimed at, Valeria, if this is for Duncan or for Karl, but as you're on camera, I'll let you ask your question.
Sure, no, it was really general about the NCSR project at all? And I apologize if it's a relatively naive question, because this is really about how far along the project is and what are the future plans. Connected to the topic of the question, of course, which was what is the idea for even future connection with ongoing academic research about all of this, because I understand there is already a theoretical framework for resilience that is quite developed, and the project is already, it's more moving into, let's say, practice. And I was curious if there's still space for connecting with, let's say, new initiatives on and initiatives in the academic domain. For instance, what I know about is a few projects going on defining different indexes of resilience, composite indicators of course, then different interpretations of resilience that might not all necessarily fit. But in short, the question was about is the theoretical side of things already essentially defined, or is that also still dynamic and evolving?
Thank you. I think David's come to the screen to answer that by the looks of it.
I can certainly answer part of it, really. The answer is no. We'd love to hear actually about any ongoing pieces of research, academic or practitioner based, because we think the webinar series is a great opportunity for people like yourself to come along and explain some of the exciting stuff that you may be doing, or indeed some of the new learning. And that really interesting thing about resilience indicators is so topical. So how do you prove benefit to society? How do you measure the activity as an effective outcome? Maybe you'd be kind enough to reach out to us in the chat with an email, and I'll get back to you. But yeah, I think we'd quite like to get a few more different academics along to come and share some of their work, actually, so we make sure we are always keeping up to date with what else might be going on. Duncan, if you want to come back to the more wider sense about how we connect into broader research.
Sure, I don't have much more to say other than what you've just said, David, but I agree with David that I think sharing different lessons, whether they're from research or whether they're from practice, is absolutely great and absolutely key, and that's what we've been doing through the webinars, as David says. The manual strategy also includes that, but just in the background rather than in the foreground. But as David says, reach out. Yeah, there's be delighted to.
Thank you very much.
More.
Thank you, this helps a lot.
Brilliant, thank you. And sort of touching on that, we had a question to Karl from I think it was from Kerry about wanting to know more detail about the resilience indicators, what specific data markers are being used, which also I'm personally interested in. I think everyone's interested in that, like how do we measure it? And do you have anything you can share with us, or any advice around that?
There's so many measurement tools out there. And yeah, and being on the other side of the fence, working for Greater Manchester, yeah, when I've used many of these tools. One thing that I found most useful, most recently, is something that was developed by the University of Manchester in collaboration with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. It's part of their Climate Just work. And they created a heat vulnerability index and a flood vulnerability index. And it's really, really useful stuff. And I think they're in the process of updating it with the most recent census information. But it really goes, lots of indicators looking at how different places, spatially across the UK, how vulnerable they are to either to the risks of heat waves or to the risks of flooding. But vulnerability isn't a static thing. We've got to think about vulnerability in relation to something. And there'll be crossovers between what makes a community vulnerable to flooding and heat waves, but also there'll be differences as well. But yeah, so this the Climate Just work is one source, I think, which is really valuable, and it has a range of indicators that you can then use to potentially, and the way I've used it is to identify priority areas for investment or for intervention.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks for that, Karl. Kerry, as you're on camera, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. No, I didn't. Well, it was just to kind of build upon that as well. Absolutely, resilience is not a static state. This resilience index concept is something. Sorry, Scottish Government. Hi. It's been something I've been struggling with from an emergency perspective for. I feel like it's been about 2 or 3 years. You know, I've been doing a lot of research, exploratory papers, discovering the million different resilience indexes that have been made, and I think the challenge is, who decides what data indicators are important as well, because there's lots of different things that may help a community be more or less resilient to emergency shocks, but it's kind of gaining that consensus, and also bringing in the qualitative, the kind of the self-assessment aspects of that as well, you know, from the kind of emergency response community who kind of work in partnership with community groups in their local regions as well, because their opinion is just as valid as many data indicators. So it's, yeah, anything that you can share that, you know, you think there's a bit of insight in there we can gather. I have no answers. I'm really curious.
Yeah, sure. There's one thing which I can share, which is around the CRMC tool, which has been developed by the Flood Resilience Alliance, which tries to use kind of survey data as well as secondary source data and key informant interviews and focus group discussions all together to try and paint a picture of a community. So it's specifically about community resilience, paint a picture of that community to aid decision making in terms of what activities could potentially improve that community's resilience. I can't say it's, you know, I know that this is the best way of doing that, but it is a way. And I think the important thing is to try and, you know, it's that kind of use the data that's available, plus have those conversations in a, if possible, in a systematic way, to kind of combine those two things to then begin to kind of work out what we need to do.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Karl. So a question for Duncan, although I think you might have already answered it actually. Will NCSR focus on specific UK locations going forward, or remain an expert knowledge hub, or both?
Both.
Nice.
That's
Brilliant.
the quick answer. Of course, we conduct research in a place, but also across. I think what we're also going to be interested in doing is bringing in a more international perspective as well. So we've done that a little bit, but we'll be broadening our understanding of places the consortium becomes more mature. Not adding to the partners in the consortium, but more bringing those lessons in.
Fantastic, thank you. A message from Stuart Marshall to Karl, saying thanks, Karl. Agree, reference the step change. This is a significant change in skills and work processes and mindsets, etc. But often the initial work has been undertaken by those with an emergency planning background. What skills, competencies or resilience teams need to incorporate development if they're going to work effectively in this area? Is there any relevant training or competence, or is it more of conditioning through doing? Oh, Karl, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so really good question. And you know, emergency planners or people involved in emergency planning can't do everything and can't be everything to all people. So there is something about scope creep here, and actually focusing on making sure that we, you know, are preparing our places for the range of risks that we face. There are people already working in our communities who are working on resilience. You know, the voluntary community sector, they are there on the ground working on resilience. Our local authorities are there working on resilience. It may have a slightly different angle, but they are there in the communities trying to, you know, improve the well-being, improve the capabilities, and to build resilience of places. So it's about tapping into that activity that's already happening, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you, Karl. And there is, I think it's more of a statement from Ralph. I'm not sure, Ralph, if you want to come onto camera, but you're talking about how much do urban designers routinely think about resilience. I'm not sure if that was a question or just more of a generic question, really, for the group. But Ralph, if you're still there, would you like to ask?
Oh, sorry, I've got a bit of a streaming cold at the moment, which is why I had the camera turned off. And no, it was supposed to be a question. I forgot the question mark, but I suppose a bit of a rhetorical question, because in my experience, they don't a huge amount, or not in a joined up way, or not unless it's part of a specific brief, but it's not a kind of a, you know, one of the big holistic themes behind urban design. And I could be wrong, and I definitely stand to be corrected by people who are more experts in that field than I am. But as an ex-town planner, that was my take on it. So I suppose it was just, you know, kind of there probably are a lot of very relevant kind of strands running through kind of town planning practice and development planning practice, but possibly don't think of themselves in terms of, or didn't used to think of themselves in terms of contributing to resilience. So I just thought that was really interesting. And I'll turn the camera off again now, so you don't have to watch me sneeze.
Thanks, Ralph, and yeah, I'll get well soon. I'm glad we're remote. Karl, do you have anything to say to that, or to add your thoughts?
No, I've got nothing to add to that. Yeah, it's you know, different urban designers, I think, will think of things in different ways. I think one thing that we frequently say is that, you know, it's the point that I mentioned earlier, that some of these brilliant co-benefits from a development that's put in place at the planning application stage, you know, we end up losing some of those things, and it's how do we kind of try and I suppose advocate for those aspects to be essential, and not, you know, kind of add-ons. So frequently when we think about resilience, it's sometimes seen as a bit of a bolt-on, a bit of an add-on, rather than an essential part of that of the design.
Interesting, thank you, Karl. There's an unknown user, unfortunately the name hasn't come up in the chat, who's put WRT skills for the next generation of new resilience and emergency professionals. So the apprenticeship includes societal resilience, stakeholder and participatory and engagement skills. I'm not sure if that is a question or a statement.
It's L. Parker.
Oh,
Becky,
lovely. Oh, sorry, you've got it. I haven't noticed it coming off my screen. Sorry, hi, Eleanor.
Hi, just with reference to skills and stuff, it was a bit of a shameless plug really, but I think as some of you are aware, we published in January, and I was really keen to include in there the sort of whole of society perspective as the foundation for the future training and competence for those who perhaps would traditionally call themselves emergency planners and perhaps now would refer to themselves as resilience and emergencies professionals. So that was all. And the latest edition of Update has just come out on the LinkedIn page for the apprenticeship. So that's all.
Oh, fantastic! Thank you. I'll look that up as soon as I'm off this. And there's no need to feel bad about shamelessly plugging. That's a fantastic thing. Right, well, that actually does bring us up to just about past. So if there are any other questions, we'll in the chat, which I might have missed, I'll just pick that up afterwards and send that across to Duncan. But I would just like to say thank you for everyone for your attendance today, and the contributions to all the working groups and conferences and workshops and webinars, and especially massive thank you to Duncan and David, Roisin and Andrew and the crew, and Chris as well as the co-chair. I think the steps in the 8-step strategy are really clear, and the modular training coming up for next year, or from this year, the academic year, I suppose, on the community hubs, organised volunteers, spontaneous volunteers, local community networks and local essential services are really exciting. And also the national conference in March in Manchester, something to look forward to, and hear about how the strategy has been implemented across different LRFs and organisations. So lots to look forward to, and a great strategy launch. But I'll hand it over back to Chris, who's been commentating throughout the day.
Well, thank you, Becky, and thank you again, certainly to the contributions, not only of the people presenting today, but obviously from that engagement in the chat. It really makes these events worthwhile, and hopefully, you know, we are there to be able to share information, as we've mentioned before. So a big day for all of us at NCR Plus. Thank you to all of the contributors, and look forward to catching you on our next NCSR meeting. All the very best, and thank you for joining.